In the midst of a routine mission, Staff Sergeant Ethan Miller encounters a situation that will challenge his very sense of duty. While surveying the bustling crowd at the airport, his keen instincts detect a subtle, yet unmistakable sign of danger. A young girl, Chloe Morgan, is being led by a man who doesn't seem to have her best interests at heart. As her eyes silently scream for help, Ethan faces a choice that could cost him everything: to stick to the rules or follow his heart and break them. What he doesn't know is that his decision will unravel a web of deception, danger, and a race against time to save a life. Staff Sergeant Ethan Miller had always been a man of discipline, a soldier who valued order and followed the rules with unwavering precision. The rigid structure of his job was what kept him grounded, and he prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, his dedication to his duty. But today, something felt different. As he stood in the crowded airport terminal, watching the ebb and flow of passengers, his instincts began to prickle, pulling his attention to a small, seemingly inconspicuous detail. It was the way Chloe Morgan, a young girl no older than 10, was being led by a man who didn't look like her father. Ethan's sharp gaze took in the scene, noting the way Chloe's body stiffened with every step, the way her eyes darted nervously around the room as though she were searching for something, or someone. At first, Ethan chalked it up to the usual discomfort children feel when they're in unfamiliar surroundings, but there was something more. A subtle unease lingered in the way the man gripped her arm too tightly, the way he kept steering her toward the exit as if trying to rush her away from prying eyes. Then, it happened. As the pair passed by, Chloe's eyes met Ethan's. For a brief, fleeting moment, their gazes locked. It was a look that sent a chill down Ethan's spine, a silent cry for help, barely perceptible but undeniable. The weight of that glance hit him like a hammer. She didn't say a word, but the terror in her eyes spoke volumes. His heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. His military training kicked in instantly, but this wasn't just about protocol, this was something deeper, more visceral. His instincts screamed that the child was in danger, that she wasn't just a lost kid being escorted by a stranger. Ethan's mind raced. He knew the risks of going against protocol. His orders were clear: remain on duty, keep a watchful eye on security. But the moment Chloe's gaze met his, the rules no longer mattered. He couldn't stand by and do nothing, couldn't let that silent plea for help go unanswered. His pulse quickened, the decision weighing heavily on his chest as he made up his mind in an instant. Without a second thought, he broke away from his post and moved swiftly through the crowd, his focus entirely on the pair. His heart pounded in his ears, but there was no time for hesitation. He had to act. He approached the man and the girl with calculated calmness, forcing himself to maintain control despite the adrenaline that surged through him. His voice was firm, unwavering, as he demanded the man release her immediately. The stranger froze, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Ethan could see the fear flicker in the man's eyes. He knew something was off. The tension in the air was thick, like the calm before a storm. Ethan's hand instinctively hovered near his weapon, his mind prepared for anything. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice a low growl, every syllable laced with authority. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on Chloe's arm, but he didn't answer. The girl, however, couldn't hide her fear any longer. Her lips trembled, and with a quiet, almost imperceptible nod, she whispered her name, Lily Davis. Ethan's heart lurched as the reality hit him. This wasn't just a case of a scared child, this was a girl who had been abducted, a girl who had been lied to about the death of her parents. His suspicions were confirmed: she was the victim of a far darker plot. The confrontation escalated quickly. The man, now desperate, made a move to push past Ethan, but Ethan was ready. In an instant, a struggle ensued, chaotic, frantic. Ethan's military training kicked in, and he was able to subdue the man long enough for backup to arrive. Within minutes, local law enforcement and security forces swarmed the scene, taking the man into custody. Lily, was safe, her ordeal finally over. But as the adrenaline began to fade, Ethan couldn't ignore the consequences of his actions. He had violated protocol, gone against orders. In the aftermath, he would have to face the fallout, the disciplinary hearings. But none of that mattered now. Lily was alive, free from the clutches of a criminal network that had believed it could operate in the shadows. Ethan had done what he believed was right, and for the first time in his career, he felt that maybe, just maybe, the rules weren't the only thing that mattered. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps as the weight of what had just occurred began to settle over him. The world around him felt like it was moving in slow motion, each sound muted, each movement dragging on. His heart was still pounding in his chest, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as if his body hadn't quite caught up with the reality of the situation. His hands, once steady, were now trembling, and he could feel the sweat on his brow despite the cold night air. His mind kept replaying the events, the moment he had seen Chloe in the grip of that man, her wide, terrified eyes locked with his, begging for help without saying a word. The signal. The unmistakable sign that something was wrong. Ethan had acted without thinking, without hesitation. His training kicked in, but it wasn't just that, it was something deeper. A gut instinct, a primal sense that told him he couldn't stand by and watch. He couldn't wait for backup or rely on protocol. He had broken the rules. The thought lingered in his mind like an unshakable weight, and with it came the gnawing realization that he had acted outside of the system, outside of everything he'd been trained to uphold. That realization twisted inside him, gnawing at his sense of self-discipline. He had stepped outside the boundaries, had put everything on the line, his career, his reputation, everything he had worked for. But as he watched Lily being escorted to safety by the officers, her small form trembling but safe, another truth settled in his heart: he had saved her. He had done what was necessary. And yet, the consequences hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. As the officers were guiding the suspect toward the squad car, Ethan's superior officer, Lieutenant Jacob Harris, approached him. The man's expression was hard as stone, his jaw clenched tight. Ethan could already feel the impending reprimand in the air, thick and suffocating. He could feel the weight of Harris's gaze, sharp and unyielding. This was not going to be an easy conversation. Not by a long shot. "What the hell were you thinking, Miller?" Harris's voice was low and dangerous, barely above a whisper but carrying the full force of his fury. Ethan could feel his heart sink, the blood draining from his face as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. "You completely disregarded protocol. You're not some lone hero in a movie. You don't get to make decisions like that." Ethan met the lieutenant's gaze, his own eyes burning with a mix of exhaustion and frustration. He knew Harris was right, in theory. He knew the importance of following orders, of trusting the system, of waiting for backup. But this time, it had felt wrong to wait. It had felt wrong to let the rules dictate what needed to be done when a child's life was on the line. "I couldn't just stand by," Ethan replied, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "She was in danger. I saw it in her eyes. I couldn't wait for backup. I had to act." Harris exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand across his face in frustration. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see the danger? But you can't go off the rails every time you see something that doesn't sit right with you. We have protocols for a reason. This could have turned out a lot worse, Miller. A hell of a lot worse." Ethan's gaze drifted briefly to the ground, his fists clenched at his sides as the weight of the situation settled on him. He had acted on instinct, driven by a need to protect, but the consequences of that were now undeniable. His career was in jeopardy. The rules he had spent years adhering to now felt like chains he was no longer sure he could bear. But as his gaze shifted back to the officers with Lily, safe and unharmed, something deep inside him fought against the creeping self-doubt. Yes, he had broken the rules, but hadn't he done the right thing? "I know," Ethan said quietly, his voice a little softer now. "But sometimes the system isn't enough." It wasn't enough for her. "I had to do something." Harris stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Ethan could feel the tension in the air, the judgment, the disbelief. He knew he was teetering on the edge of something that could shatter his career if he wasn't careful. But then, unexpectedly, Harris's hard expression softened just slightly, the edges of his mouth twitching into something that almost resembled a weary understanding. "You're lucky it worked out," Harris muttered, his voice quieter now, though still carrying an edge. "You're lucky that girl's safe. But don't think for a second that this is some kind of pass for breaking every rule in the book. You can't just decide to go rogue whenever it feels right." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the sting of his superior's words deep in his chest. He wasn't looking for forgiveness, he wasn't even sure if he deserved it. But hearing that small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, the fact that Harris understood, even if just a little, helped settle the chaos swirling in Ethan's mind. "I won't do it again," Ethan said quietly, his voice firm. I couldn't watch her slip away." Harris didn't respond immediately, his gaze lingering on Ethan for another long moment before he nodded, just once, his eyes betraying a hint of reluctant respect. "Just make sure you don't have to," Harris finally replied, his tone softer, almost regretful. "You don't always get a second chance, Miller." As the officers finally led the suspect away, Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his chest heavy, his mind still reeling. But as his eyes drifted to the small figure of Lily, now safe, now free from the hands of the man who had held her hostage, a quiet sense of resolve began to form inside him. He had made a choice. It had been the wrong choice in the eyes of the rules, but in his heart, he knew it had been the right one. Sometimes, rules weren't enough. Sometimes, people had to be saved, even if it meant breaking everything you've ever known. The hours that followed the confrontation were a blur of movement and noise, but Ethan Miller could hardly hear or see anything but the deep weight in his chest. It was as if his mind had slowed down, retreating into a fog, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in those brief moments. He could still feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by something else, doubt. He had acted instinctively, the way he had always been trained to, but now that the chaos was over and the adrenaline was beginning to wear off, the stark reality of his decision hit him. He had broken every rule in the book. He had defied protocol, gone against orders, and had put himself, and the entire operation, at risk. And yet, as he stood near the patrol car, watching the officers continue to process the scene, he couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. His eyes drifted toward the back of the car where Lily, or Chloe, or whatever her name was now, sat wrapped in a blanket, her small frame hunched over as she sipped from a cup of water. She looked fragile, like a doll that had been broken and repaired too many times. The same child who had been dragged by the stranger, who had silently begged for help with just a glance, was now safe. She was free. But at what cost? Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of the man who had been dragging her, the man who had so casually dismissed the girl's humanity. The man who had no idea that Ethan would stop him, that someone would care enough to notice. He had thought the child was just another victim, just another nameless face to be forgotten. But Ethan hadn't forgotten. He couldn't. He never would. But what if he had been wrong? What if the man had been a relative? What if Ethan had misjudged the situation, gone too far, and made a critical error? The possibility gnawed at him like a persistent ache, one he couldn't shake, no matter how many times he replayed the events in his mind. The truth was, there was no way of knowing for sure until it was too late, and by then, it would have been impossible to undo. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden presence of Lieutenant Harris. The older man's usually stern expression softened when he saw Ethan, his eyes studying him with a hint of something unreadable. Harris was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. Ethan wasn't sure whether he wanted to hear what was coming next. The guilt inside him was like a heavy chain, but he knew he had to face the consequences of his actions, whatever they might be. "You did good, Miller," Harris said finally, his voice low but not unkind. "I'm not saying it was the right call, but I won't deny it, you saved that girl." The words hit Ethan in a strange way. On one hand, there was a sense of relief, validation that, yes, his decision had been the right one in the end, but the feeling quickly dissipated, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. He had saved Lily, but at what cost? What had he given up in the process? The rules, the procedures, the very things that had guided him throughout his career, had suddenly felt like constraints rather than safeguards. "I know," Ethan replied, his voice low, rough. He looked away, trying to fight the emotions bubbling up inside him. "But it doesn't feel like enough." "It never does it? You break the rules, you risk everything, and you save one life. And then, what happens next? What about all the others?" Harris studied him for a long moment, a look of quiet understanding crossing his face. "You're not wrong. There's always more to be done. More lives to save, more people to protect. But right now, what matters is that she's safe. You did what needed to be done. You acted when no one else did. And sometimes that's all we can do." Ethan didn't respond immediately, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew the job wasn't glamorous. He knew it wasn't about the glory or recognition. It wasn't about breaking rules or doing things the easy way. It was about saving lives. Protecting people. But there was something deeper at play, something he hadn't fully grasped until now. Lily's face, pale and worn but now free from fear, flickered in his mind. He could still see her wide eyes, her desperation when she silently reached out to him for help. The fact that he had been the one to notice, to act, to intervene, that was something he would never forget. It wasn't just the success of the mission. It wasn't even just the satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference. It was the realization that sometimes, in this line of work, you had to follow your instincts. You had to trust that gut feeling, that inner voice telling you when to push forward and when to pull back. And in that moment, his gut had told him to act, and he had. But the questions still lingered. The fear, the uncertainty, it wouldn't go away so easily. As Harris continued to speak, Ethan's thoughts drifted to the next phase of this operation, the aftermath. The investigation. The network of criminals behind this horrific abduction. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The rules and protocols would come into play, and he would have to answer for his actions. But tonight, in his heart, Ethan knew one thing for sure: he had saved a life. And that, at least, was enough to carry him through whatever came next. The sound of the sirens faded into the background as Ethan Miller stood at the edge of the scene, his body tense and weary from the rush of adrenaline that had surged through him just moments earlier. The chaos around him, uniformed officers securing the perimeter, forensic specialists gathering evidence, felt distant, almost surreal, as his mind kept replaying the key moments from the last few minutes. He felt detached from it all, as if he were watching himself from afar, not entirely sure of what he had just done. His pulse still raced, But there was a different kind of urgency now, a deep, gnawing sense of unease that settled in his stomach like a stone. Ethan had spent years training for moments like this, but none of the textbooks or drills had prepared him for the weight of that decision, the one he had made in the heat of the moment when he had stepped away from protocol to protect a child in danger. He had broken the rules that were there for a reason, that kept him, and everyone else, safe. And yet, despite that, there was no sense of regret, only a heavy awareness that sometimes, the law had to take a back seat to what was right. His gaze drifted back to the squad car parked a few yards away, where Chloe Morgan, formerly known as Lily, was sitting in the back, wrapped in a blanket, her small frame huddled against the chill of the evening air. Her face, once filled with the terror of captivity, now carried a faint expression of relief, though it was clear she was still processing everything that had just happened. She hadn't spoken a word since the rescue, her silence spoke volumes, though. Ethan didn't know what she was thinking, what memories haunted her, but he could see the fragility in her eyes. The fear was still there, lingering beneath the surface, just waiting to be unleashed. He couldn't help but think back to the moment when he had first seen her, her terrified face, her stiff posture, the way she had flinched when he had reached for her. It had been so quick, but that instant of hesitation, the doubt that had crept into his mind, still echoed in his thoughts. What if he had been wrong? What if he had misinterpreted the situation? But then, in that split second, he had seen her eyes, the pleading look that told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. She was in danger. She needed help. The confrontation with the kidnapper had been a blur of motion, chaotic and intense. Ethan had approached the man, his training kicking in, but there had been a wild, unpredictable energy in the air. The man had resisted, his body stiff with aggression, his eyes filled with panic. It was clear he hadn't expected to be confronted, and the desperation in his movements had been unsettling. Ethan's grip on him had been firm, determined, and for a moment, it had felt like the world was suspended in that one action, a single choice that had changed everything. When backup arrived, the suspect was swiftly apprehended, but the image of the man's face stayed with Ethan. The dark eyes, full of malice and calculation. The way he had tried to fight back, as though Chloe's life were simply a means to an end. Ethan's blood boiled at the thought. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity, it was a cold, calculated act of cruelty, something far deeper than a mere abduction. This was a man who had believed he could control another life, manipulate it, erase its identity for his own benefit. And it made Ethan sick to his core. The team had taken over, but Ethan couldn't shake the image of Chloe, her trembling hands, her quiet sobs. His protective instincts, those that had been honed during years of service, had kicked in the moment he saw her, but now, in the stillness that followed, he found himself questioning everything. How many other children were out there? How many other lives had been torn apart by the same people who had taken Chloe? And how many more would suffer if he didn't push harder, fight harder to bring down the entire network? Ethan, a voice broke through his internal storm. It was Claire, his colleague, her expression soft but knowing. She had been watching from a distance, and now she approached him with a calm, steady demeanor. "You okay?" Ethan turned to face her, his jaw tightening as he exhaled slowly. He didn't know how to respond. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I did what I had to do, but I keep thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't acted. What if I hadn't noticed? What if she—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Claire gave him a reassuring smile, her eyes filled with empathy. "You saved her. You did the right thing. That's all that matters." But Ethan couldn't let go of the what-ifs, the doubts. What if he had been wrong? What if this was all just some twisted coincidence? But no, the more he thought about it, the more he was sure. Chloe had been marked, trapped in a nightmare that only Ethan had been able to stop. And now, with the kidnapper behind bars and the investigation underway, they had the chance to dismantle an entire network, one that had hurt countless others. "Thanks," Ethan muttered, his eyes drifting back to the squad car, where Chloe was now speaking softly with a detective. It wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until the people behind this were brought to justice. As Claire gave him a supportive pat on the shoulder and walked away, Ethan allowed himself a moment of quiet. His hands were still trembling, his heart still pounding, but a sense of relief had started to settle over him. For the first time since the chaos had begun, he felt like he had done something truly meaningful. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about doing what was right. And Chloe had a chance now, a chance at a life free from fear, from pain, from the darkness that had tried to consume her. Ethan couldn't undo what had been done to her, but he had given her something precious: hope. In the days that followed the incident, Ethan Miller found himself at the center of a storm he hadn't expected, not of chaos, but of scrutiny. Media outlets praised his courage. Headlines labeled him a hero. Parents sent thank-you letters. But inside the base, the atmosphere was far more complicated. He sat silently in the commander's office, his uniform crisp but his expression heavy. A panel of officers questioned his every decision: why he left his post, why he didn't call for backup immediately, why he physically intervened instead of following protocol. They were doing their job, of course. There were procedures. And Ethan had broken them all in the span of 5 minutes. But he answered every question with steady eyes. Not defensive, not arrogant, just honest. "I saw a child in danger," he said. "She gave a silent cry for help. And I couldn't ignore it." When they brought up the potential risks of setting a precedent for others to act on instinct, Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded. Because he knew his actions had been personal, not procedural. And yes, it came at a cost. Later, alone in his barracks, Ethan stared at the official notice on his desk. Temporary suspension pending review. It was expected. It didn't make it easier. His thoughts drifted back to Chloe. He had visited her once after the rescue, just briefly. She had been quiet, withdrawn, sitting in the corner of a brightly lit child services room with a small stuffed animal in her lap. But when she saw Ethan, her eyes lit up. She ran into his arms without hesitation. In that brief moment, all the uncertainty, the backlash, the risk, it all faded. That embrace meant more than any medal ever could. A few days later, he received a call from Detective Grant. Her voice was filled with quiet urgency. "They raided a compound in Arizona," she said. "Based on the info we found in the suspect's van. Dozens of kids, Ethan. Dozens. Your instinct blew open an entire trafficking network." He sat down, overwhelmed, heart pounding with disbelief and sorrow. "You saved more than one life," she continued. "You may have saved an entire generation from being lost." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, though he didn't let them fall. It was too much to fully grasp. He wasn't the kind of man who looked for recognition. He had joined the service to protect, to serve, not to be thanked. But now, he understood something deeper. Sometimes, the rules had to bend for humanity to prevail. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant risking everything. Standing by the window, he looked out over the base, the sun rising slowly, casting golden light over the tarmac. He straightened his shoulders, not out of pride, but resolve. Whatever came next, suspension, court review, even dismissal, he would face it. Because he had done what was right, not just what was expected. And in the quiet of that morning, Ethan Miller made a silent vow: if ever faced with the same choice again, he would choose to act. Every single time. As Ethan Miller's heart raced in the final moments of the confrontation, the relief of saving Lily Davis was bittersweet. The man was arrested, the child was free, but the cost of breaking protocol weighs heavily on his shoulders. Despite the consequences he faces, Ethan knows deep down that sometimes doing what's right doesn't always align with the rules. This is more than just a rescue, it's a reminder that in moments of crisis, courage and compassion are the true measures of heroism. As the dust settles, one question remains: will the system forgive the man who broke its rules to save a life? Only time will tell.